Hello, everybody. Let's start. Welcome to Joel Mokyr's lecture. My name is Andrei Markovich. I'm a professor at the New Economics School, and I will moderate today's session. Our lecture will be in English on Zoom. You can also switch to simultaneous Russian translation by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of Zoom window and choose your preferred language. The broadcast of the lecture is also going on YouTube channels of the New Economics School and Commencement Publishing House. I am glad to see so many people. There are already 300 participants in the Zoom, and I guess more than 1,000 in YouTube channel. We would like to know where you are joining us from, and for the beginning, now a link should appear to a short poll on your location should appear in the chat. So please follow this link, and we encourage you to participate in this poll. Before we start, let me say a couple of words about the New Economics School guest lecture series, which we start today. There will be 5 lectures, one per week in this series. And the last one will be on the 14th of October, 2020. The lectures cover a range of different topics. We start with a lecture on economic history today. After that, there will be a lecture how modern economic research could help us to deal with current economic issues and how it could contribute to policy debate. Then we will learn something important about challenges facing capitalism today and how capitalism will likely evolve in the future. The last lecture will be about addiction to modern technologies and how to overcome such addiction. All lectures will be in English with a simultaneous translation into Russian. Participation is free, but pre-registration is required. The current NIS guest lecture series is a part of broader project, namely NIS Public Lectures. And this project has been lasting already for 3 years. Now let me introduce our today's speaker, Professor Joel Mokyr from Northwestern University. Professor Mokyr is one of the leading and most influential modern economic historians. And I should say that it is really quite difficult to overestimate Joel's contribution to the field of modern economic history. He published extensively. He published a number of important books and numerous papers on various topics, such as the origins of industrial revolution and the role of cultural factors in economic development. His research focuses on the economic and intellectual roots of technological progress and the growth of useful knowledge in historical perspective. Not surprisingly, as you can imagine, his research got public recognition. In particular, if you read the Economist magazine, and specifically the latest issue, and the latest debate discussion in the magazine, how culture could help to explain the distribution of poverty and wealth in the modern world, you will find Joel's name in this issue, and the Economist refers to Joel. Not that many economists got this privilege. Professor Mokyr got his PhD in economics from Yale University. Currently, Joel is professor of economics at Northwestern University, but at the same time, he is a professor of history in Northwestern University. This is also quite a rare combination, I should say. During his career, he took various academic positions. He served as the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Economic History. He is a former president of the Economic History Association, and so on and so forth. He was the winner. He was the 2006 winner of the Heineken Award for History offered by the Royal Dutch Academy of Science, and the winner of 2015 Balzan International Prize for Economic History. Today, Joel speaks about the Great Enrichment. We advertised his talk as a talk with the following title: The Great Enrichment, How Western Europe Became Global Economic Leader in the 18th and 19th Centuries. You will see Joel's answer to this question already on his first slide. Let me make several short announcements before I will give the floor to Professor Mokyr. First of all, I would like to thank our partners with whom we do this lecture series. We are grateful to the charitable foundation SAFMAR, who supports NS public lectures. Our media partners are publishing house Kommersant and the media website of the Russian Central Bank, Econs Online. Special thanks to our other partner, Voodoo Project. Also, let me say that there will be a short quiz for participants after the lecture, before the Q&A session. The quiz will be available in both English and Russian languages. Accordingly, 2 winners will be awarded with free 2-month subscription to Bookmate electronic book service. Also, the author of the best question to the speaker will get the same prize. So please start to prepare your questions. You can type them in chats, and I will choose the most interesting questions and ask them to Professor Mokyr after his talk in the Q&A session. Please submit your emails address when you participate in the quiz or when you type your questions. Then we will be able to contact you back if you get a prize. Another thing which I want to say is that if you want to learn more about NS events, you should either start to follow our official social media accounts, or you can register at the NS website to get our newsletters for prospective students. The final thing which I would like to announce before Joel will start to deliver his lecture is to advertise the next lecture, which will be delivered by the Nobel Prize winner Estelle Duflo on September 16 at 5 p.m. Moscow time. So I'm sorry for a bit long introduction, but that's all I wanted to say in the beginning. Joel, now the floor is yours, and we are very welcome at the New Economic School to see you at least online and host this seminar.
Thank you very much, Andrei. Before I put up my slide, I just wanted to say thank you to Andrei and to Elena Morozova to making this possible. Maybe one reflection, this pandemic has obviously disrupted everybody's life beyond recognition, and we're still not seeing the end of it. But one of the few sort of positive things to come out of this is that we are now much more than before willing and able to reach a global audience when we give talks. I mean, I miss the travel, I miss going out to dinner after the talk and having all the sort of personal contact. But it's nice that we have people from so many countries that can join in basically from the comfort of their living room. And so that's kind of I guess what we call a silver lining. All right, so that said, let me get going. The title that I will actually use is slightly different than the one that's announced, but the content will be essentially the same, so there should be no all right, so hang on just 1 minute. Why isn't this sharing the screen? There we go. All right. So the title the title will be Attitudes, Aptitudes, and the Origins of the Great Enrichment. I immediately have to add that the term the Great Enrichment is not mine. It is my dear friend Deirdre McCloskey's, who proposed it as an alternative to the term that was current until then, which was the Great Divergence. And I'll say something about that later on. But I want to start from a slightly different point of view. I want to ask a very naive and maybe even sort of stupid question, but one that I haven't actually heard asked in recent years. So I think everybody here is aware that we are currently experiencing in the United States a wave of protests against racial injustice and discrimination. There is the Black Lives Matter movement, and everybody is engaged in a conversation about race and the differences between white and non-white people. And so here is this naive question, which is, why really isn't it ever the other way around? I mean, we know that whites had black slaves. We know very few cases in which black people had white slaves. We know Europeans exploited and colonized Africa and Asia, but we never hear about African and Asian colonial empires exploiting Europeans. And so the history is that in the last 400 years, really more, almost 500 years, Europeans have dominated and subjugated and enslaved and exploited much of the rest of humanity in all kinds of ways. And I think the remnants of that asymmetrical relation are still at the foundation of today's race relations. And that's not just true in the United States. You see this really almost everywhere. You look at that. Say in the Western Hemisphere, you look at Brazil and you look at Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Caribbeans, and everywhere you see this discrepancy between white and non-white people. Even in Europe, where black slavery was never really introduced on any large scale, we still observe the same. For instance, in France and UK, where people of African and Asian descent are discriminated against and disadvantaged by white people, all the way from mortgage lenders and employers to police brutality. And I don't want to talk about politics because that's not what my talk is about. It isn't just racism. Obviously, it's related to racism. But what I mean by racism is just basically people don't like each other because they don't look the same, or they don't sound the same, or they don't believe in the same God or something like that. What we're talking about is more than racism. It's racism, but it's more than racism. It's racism coupled to inequality or asymmetry. And they're related, of course, because, as I said, racism usually implies inequality, but at least logically speaking, they're not quite the same. And then the question is why? And what is the source of this inequality? And actually, there is no obvious answer. There is nothing inherent in whiteness or in European unchanging culture, Christianity or something like that, or geography that would explain it, much less, of course, bogus theories based on genetics, which I won't even dignify with a mention, that would explain it. And the evidence for that is multiple, but really the smoking gun is that it wasn't always so. And if you go back 1,000 years, you go to the year 1000. So Christian Europe was an ignorant, impoverished, violent backwater. Whereas if you look at non-Christian or non-white worlds, say the world of Islam in the Middle East or North Africa or the Song dynasty in China, what you see is sophisticated and literate societies that have made major advances in medicine, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, literature, and on and on and on. And so rather than use this term, the Great Divergence that Pomeranz popularized, we really should think of this as the great reversal that Europeans used to be behind and then somehow managed to maneuver themselves into an advantageous position. So if it isn't biology, or if it isn't geography, or if it isn't even some unchanging element of culture, it must be history. Somehow, white people, that is to say Europeans, acquired some kind of mysterious advantage over brown and black people that allowed this inequality to emerge. And this, of course, created early colonialism in the 16th and 17th century. And then, of course, the second wave of colonialism in the 19th century. And it created this enormous gap between the incomes of white as opposed to non-white peoples, both within and between different economies, okay? Now, before I go on, there is an incredible irony here, and that is that Europeans were able to colonize and subjugate and enslave and exploit people elsewhere in the world, yet the descendants of these subjugated and exploited people today are far richer than their ancestors ever were, thanks in large part to what Europeans did. And the historical watershed is what Deirdre Buklowski calls the Great Enrichment, which is not just the gap between West and East, but the sort of the worldwide rise in living standards. And so, no, all the same, of course, we're still struggling with the legacies and the remnants of this asymmetry, and it's something that we have to explain. So if you wanted to explain the origins of this in one word, what would it be? And my answer would be this: it would be knowledge. And yet, again, if you go back, not even 1,000 years, even 750 years, okay, you go back to say 1250 AD, high Middle Ages. Other civilizations at that time were clearly more advanced in science and technology, had better educational structure, higher literacy, more human capital. It's hard to say that Europeans in some way knew more. But on the eve of the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, contemporaries realized that the gap was there. So here's a famous quote from a book by Dr. Samuel Johnson, the Dr. Johnson, who wrote the famous dictionary and so on. So he has a book in which he has this fictional conversation between some Abyssinian prince and some European philosopher. And the Abyssinian prince, Rasselas, asked this question. He says, by what means are the Europeans as powerful, or why, since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest, cannot the Asiatics, that's 18th century English, Asiatics, and Africans invade their coasts, plant colonies in their ports? The same winds that carry them back would bring us thither. And the answer was provided was, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. I added that emphasis in red because that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And so, did the Europeans know more than other people, say, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution? And before we sort of, maybe just one brief remark, it isn't just how much they know, but what kind of knowledge emerges, right? And so what kind of questions are the people who create knowledge, which are mostly intellectuals, interested in, and how much of an impact do they have on the world of production and trade and things that matter to the economy? And so the answer to Prince Rasselas's question, I'm going to summarize by two words, and that's the title of my talk: attitudes and aptitudes. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, these were the result of changes that occurred in Europe, sort of in the 3 centuries before Dr. Johnson wrote these words. So basically, you go back to the middle of the 15th century in the invention of the printing press, and you take this to the Industrial Revolution, you have 300 years, which are sometimes known as early modern Europe, although that term is not popular. I just want to spend 1 minute defining my terms here, because it's not obvious what it means for a society to know something. I mean, we know what a person knows something, but what does it mean that society knows something? And the definition that I made many years ago is that social knowledge is defined as the union of the knowledge of all members, okay? So you take this vast set of people and you take the union, which means if even one person knows it, okay, then already society knows it, which is the definition of the unit. But of course, there's other question, which is, can knowledge be effective? That is to say, can it change people's behavior? So the effect of the knowledge depends on all kinds of things, and I'm just making a very partial list here. How many people know it, which is a density. How costly is it for somebody who doesn't have it to acquire it? And what I call tightness, which is to what extent do people actually know it and believe it, which isn't quite the same. Okay, so that's just the definition. Of anybody who wants to know more details can look up my 2002 book, which is called The Gift of Athena, in which I dwell upon this ad nauseam. And so in the 3 centuries before the Industrial Revolution, as I said, these factors affecting knowledge changed. And so that's when the Europeans developed the attitudes and the aptitudes that drove them to acquire this knowledge. And that knowledge, in the end, just as Dr. Johnson said, ended up in this white domination, entailing slavery and colonialism, and this huge gap in income and living standards between the Western world and the rest of the world. All right, so let me first talk about attitudes, and then we'll talk about aptitudes, okay? And so I did not mean to dismiss culture when I talked about it earlier. I think culture matters because it is, attitude is sort of part of what culture is about, but it's not an unchanging, immutable fact, as people like David Landis and others have sometimes supposed. Between 1450 and 1700 or 1750, the cultural environment in Europe changed. And I'm going to just highlight 3 dimensions. There are more, but these are 3 I'm most interested in. Okay? So let me first start with what I call skepticism. So you go back to 1450, and what the Renaissance is, of course, mostly about, which is what's called the Renaissance, is that Europe was in the process of rediscovering the learning of ancient Greece and Rome, the classical knowledge, which is what I was called it. And so they obviously realized there was a lot of wisdom and a lot of learning there. But then fairly soon they started to realize that there was a lot of error as well. And so in the Middle Ages, when this stuff is still being discovered, most people still believe that the knowledge of these great Greek and Roman philosophers and doctors was essentially sacrosanct. But then people start having doubts. And by 1500, you sort of see this already slowly bubbling to the surface. 200 years later, people like Copernicus and Galileo and Descartes and Newton, all these people you learn about in high school, basically have created a new science that dismissed the classical canon, sometimes quite impolitely, I should say. So, so this could actually border on disrespect. So already in the middle of the 16th century, the French philosopher Pierre de la Ramée, or Petrus Ramus, as he's known in Latin, already wrote his dissertation on the errors of Aristotle. And 550 years later, Francis Bacon, who's one of my heroes, wrote somewhat, I would say, insolently, that the Greek writers of science certainly do have a characteristic of the child, the readiness to talk with the inability to produce anything, because their wisdom seems worthy and barren of works, which is, rather disrespectful, I should say. And then you go back to, his countryman, William Gilbert, who wrote this famous book on magnetism called De Magnete, pioneering, widely admired book. And basically he said, I'm not going to waste time to quoting the ancients and the Greeks because they don't know, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but basically they don't know anything, and we know everything better. Now, I would argue that if you're going to have progress of knowledge, then you need skepticism. Without skepticism, there's no progress. Sacred cows are there to be slaughtered, and all knowledge, both new and old, was contestable. And this in nullius verba was the slogan of the Royal Academy in London. And in nullius verba, it basically means don't take anybody's word for it. Okay, so go and test it out yourself. Be doubtful. And even the Holy Bible itself, which had been sacrosanct for hundreds and hundreds of years, okay, couldn't escape a dispassionate textual analysis by admittedly heterodox intellectuals like Hobbes and Spinoza. Even so, the devout clerics, both Protestants and Catholics, of course, were absolutely horrified by that. Okay, and of course the traditionalists fought this tooth and nail. And there is something which the French call the querelle des anciens et des modernes. The war between the ancients and the moderns, in which people said, no, Roman and Greek civilization really is sacrosanct. They were so much smarter than we are. And the moderns basically said, no, we know more. And the truth is that the moderns, by 1700, had won this war hands down. By the 17th century, first, Galileo and then Newton, and of course, before that, even Copernicus, had hammered the last nails in the coffins of ancient physics. But it's more than physics, okay? It's everything. So here are two more examples. William Harvey basically showed that Galenus's model of the human body, certainly as far as the circulation of the blood is concerned, is completely wrong, and became famous for discovering the model of blood circulation. Francesco Redi, a Florentine physician, a little bit later, showed that Aristotle's belief in spontaneous generation of plants and insects is completely false. We can go on and on about this. There's endless examples. But basically, much of classical science is being proven wrong. And this is unusual. I mean, you start looking around the world, you look at China, you look at the Muslim world, you look at India, you even look at Jewish civilization in Europe before 1750. Basically, it's very traditionalist. What they have is what I call intellectual ancestor worship. People who came before us were smarter than we are. If you want to learn, if you want to be wise, what you have to do is look at their stuff and try to understand what they really meant, and you will be wise. The answer is all in the old books. Now, that's a view that the Europeans basically toss out the window in this period. And that's somehow unusual. I don't know why other societies didn't do this, or did this at a much lesser, but that's just how it was. So, I mean, here are some explanations, and I'm working now on a book in which we get into this a little bit more. But one possibility may be that they were less committed to ancestor worship because they lived in small nuclear families as opposed to larger clans or extended families. It's also possible that one of the reasons why Europeans were more skeptical is because of the polycentric nature of European politics, or the political fragmentation, if you want. And so, by 1500, global voyages started to make people realize that the world wasn't quite what the Greeks had described, and that, of course, helped disrupt their beliefs. All right, so skepticism. Secondly, openness. So it is a fact of history that Europeans from very early on, and even in the Middle Ages, were willing to learn from other civilizations with whom they otherwise for whom they had no love, and readily adopted, or if you want, stole their ideas when they start moving around. And so after 1500, with the Great Voyages, they learned how to make Indian cottons, Chinese silks, porcelain. They grew many new crops from the Western Hemisphere, and on and on and on. And so this is known sometimes as the Columbian Exchange. The Europeans went out there for all kinds of reasons, mostly to pillage gold and silver, and some people wanted to convert others to Christianity. But in the process, they also learned a lot about these people's techniques, and they brought these techniques with them to Europe. And so this is actually quite amazing. If you look at the relationship between Christian Europe and Islam, it's quite striking how even in the high Middle Ages already, Europeans happily adopted things that they learned from the Muslims, such as paper and decimal numerals, which of course are known as Arabic numerals, so they aren't Arabic, but that's a different story. And windmills and on and on and on. They taught in medical school books written by Muslim doctors like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina. And we can go on and on about this. They were drinking beverage had alcohol in them. Alcohol is an Arab word. They taught their children algebra. And we can go on and on and on. But this is quite clear from the historical record. And what is striking is that this is very asymmetrical. Europeans are willing to learn from other civilizations much more than other civilizations were willing to learn from them. And also this was true for China and Japan after 1600. It's true for Islamic civilization, which doesn't even want to adopt the printing press for hundreds of years. So clearly there is something odd about Europe there. So the best example that we have, of course, is cotton. Cotton is not grown anywhere in Europe, and Europeans learned it from non-European societies. But then they decided they liked it, and they learned eventually to spin it and weave it. And of course, they got better at it than anybody else. And then that resulted in what we see in the Industrial Revolution, in which cotton played such an important role. And so here's just one example I like very much. In 1613, Leiden University, I like Leiden University because I'm born in Leiden, established one of Europe's very first chairs of Arabic language and culture. So they're actually teaching Arabic. And its first occupant, Thomas van Erpe, those are his years, Thomas Erpenius, as he's known in Latin. And he basically, in his inaugural lecture, he says, Arab culture has a world of wisdom to teach. And that's, I think, a really interesting attitude. That is very okay. So again, I think the fragmentation of Europe may have something to do with this. Competition with other Europeans always meant that you had every unit had to run to stay in place, and so you just want to make sure that if there's some knowledge around somewhere, you don't want your neighbors to get it and you not getting it because it would put you at a disadvantage. I think that is at least one reason. There may be others. Finally, I want to talk about new philia. And so Europeans like new stuff, and they set up institutions that reward what I call intellectual innovators. Okay, so people who came up with new ideas, if they were accepted in the arts as well as in science, I should say, they were rewarded and they enjoyed very high status. I mean, just one very striking example is the great Isaac Newton, who became something of a national hero in his time, and 100,000 people showed up to his funeral in 1727. But this is true for lots of other people that you can find. These people almost became celebrities, and they often landed posh and comfortable, patronage positions. Like Galileo at the court of Florence, for instance, which is a famous example. Now, they also had to be useful because they were sustained by these rich and powerful people and kings and emperors. And so they had to help their patrons with things that these patrons were interested in. Many of them were medical doctors, but they also helped with navigation, with ballistics, engineering, as well as things that we may not appreciate, but people at the time did, astrology, and so on and on and on. And so what we're really seeing is a somewhat unusual example of the blessings of a well-functioning market. And the market I have in mind here is the market for ideas. And the market, you look at Europe at this time, what you see is competition. Everybody's competing, both on the supply and on the demand side. Right? Intellectuals are competing with one another for patronage jobs. But on the demand side, universities and royal courts wanted obviously the most famous and illustrious scholars to sort of signal their greatness, but also to render certain services like medical care, tutoring their children, and on and on and on. And so what counted in this world, just as it does today in the academic world, is the reputation of scholars among peers. Okay. And so to attain such a reputation, you had to be innovative. And so as a result, a lot of radical new ideas are being proposed between 1500 and 1750. Some were developed by Europeans themselves, some were adopted from elsewhere. Nobody cared about this, as I said. And it's obvious that not all of these new ideas were good. I would even venture to say that probably most of them were bad. we don't know about many bad ideas, but you start digging into the literature and you can see all kind of nonsense floating around. A lot of these new theories were bogus or just mistaken and sort of, fake news and pseudoscience were at least as common then as they are now, but they're harder to refute. So things like astrology and numerology were popular. And yet, you start looking at taking a step back, and you see that in the end, there is progress toward ideas that at least worked. And whenever possible, knowledge that worked was put to good use. And this is, of course, very important. So here, one example, of many that I could have chosen. So on the left, you see Evangelista Torricelli, 1643, who was a student of Galileo, who was the first to actually discover a vacuum and to discover that the Earth is covered by an atmosphere, that is atmospheric pressure. So what you see in his hand is the first barometer. Right next to it, you see Robert Boyle's vacuum pump, which actually creates a vacuum. And to the right of that, you already see sort of the first application of this. This is Denis Papin's first model. That it was just a model, it didn't actually work, but this is the first idea of how to use this as an engine. And to the right, which of course you see the very first steam engine ever built, which is Newcomen's engine in 1712. And there's a direct logical connection going from the science of Torricelli to the machine of Newcomen, who was not an educated man, and I'll come back to that later on. And so again, what explains this European neophilia? And I think all societies probably have an equal percentage of people who think outside the box and who are nonconformist and who are skeptical. But incentives different and risks different. And that, I think, is what matters more than anything else. Because in most traditional societies, being innovative or iconoclastic carries risk. And people, the word heresy or apostasy or blasphemy, these are words that today are barely used because we don't actually believe in this stuff unless you live in Pakistan, where blasphemy laws are still in the books. And so if you look at early modern Europe, a lot of these innovators were actually persecuted. And a few, not many, I must say, but a few were executed, none more famous than Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive in 1600 in Rome. But in truth, these reactionary policies didn't work. And because they require coordination by the political entities that enforce these conservative policies, but because of the polycentric nature of Europe, that coordination was missing. And so people who were smart and were intellectual innovators played these competing powers against one another and moved between these political entities. So many of those did. Here are two examples. One of them is this heretical monk, Tommaso Campanella. These are his days. And, he was put in jail, but because of the intervention of the emperor, he had very good conditions. So he actually wrote 7 books in jail. And then when he came out, including one pamphlet, by the way, that defended Galileo, and then his last years he spent in France, where he was received at the court of Louis XIII. So, by crossing boundaries and playing these powers against each other, these intellectuals could survive. Here's another famous man. This is, of course, Comenius, or Komensky, as he's known in Czech, a famous progressive philosopher and follower of Francis Bacon. He was very footloose. He spent time in Poland and in Sweden and in the Netherlands and in England. He was even offered the presidency of Harvard in 1636, which he wisely turned down. And he died in Amsterdam. So, these people moved around and, you couldn't really suppress new ideas in a world of footloose intellectuals. And so, as a result, by the late 17th century, I would say, we see something like intellectual tolerance. It doesn't quite go away, but the persecution of these deviants or innovators slowly faded. And by the middle of the 18th century, there's little more than window dressing. It's not, I think, because rulers became more tolerant and enlightened. There may be some of that, but mostly it was pointless, and it was common knowledge that was pointless. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew you couldn't do that, because if you persecute these people, they would just pack up and go elsewhere, go to the competition. You didn't want that to happen. All right. So that's attitudes. Now let me talk a little bit about aptitudes in what little time I have left. So here is a very different question. Now, people come up with new ideas, but what really constrained their effectiveness? Now, people had lots of new ideas, but they couldn't always be realized. So the most famous example, of course, is that of Leonardo, who drew hundreds of pictures of technological ideas. Here you got one example, but there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And the problem, and then there are others. Leonardo wasn't the only one, but most of these ideas couldn't be commercially realized or even scaled up. Some of them could be built. You could build a model, but you couldn't actually scale it up. So here are two examples of things that were actually built but not scaled up. This is a submarine built in 1620 by a Dutchman called Cornelis Drebbel. This is in England. He launched it in England. This is in the Thames. And here is a calculator built by Blaise Pascal in 1642. And both of these things actually worked in their own way. But we don't see a lot of use of submarines in warfare for another 250 years. I'm not sure. I'm sorry about that. And we don't see mechanical calculators until deep into the 19th century. And the answer, of course, is very simple: inadequate workmanship and materials. Now, that's a form of knowledge, primarily sort of tacit knowledge. It's not something that's written down. But that's what I call aptitude. And here, too, I would like to argue that Europe slowly gains an advantage, even if you go back as far as 1400. I mean, nobody's actually done this systematically, so this is more of an impression than anything else. But I would say that as late as 1400, say, compare Europe to China, or if you want, to India or to the Muslim civilization, these people still have superior technological capabilities in shipbuilding, in navigation, metallurgy, hydraulics, a whole bunch of engineering. But Europeans are sort of slowly catching up. And when the first Jesuits arrived in China in 1582, they start writing home and pointing out that China, in some technological areas, not all, is backward. Okay, so many of the skills that the Chinese used to have in earlier times were lost or deteriorated. Things like clockmaking or shipbuilding or things like that. Now, I think it's still not clear that in 1550 or in even 1600, Europe has some kind of advantage. Asia still is making extremely sophisticated goods that the Europeans want very badly and actually sail around Africa to get. But by 1700 or so, European artisans are quickly improving. And this is particularly true in Britain, which may not be an accident, where you start to increasingly see artisans making things like high quality clocks and watches and telescopes and microscopes and pumps, and of course after 1712 steam engines. But on the continent too, it's not just Britain. This year is Vaucanson's duck, which is a toy that was made by a Frenchman called Jacques de Vaucanson. That was, very clever kind of clockwork in it, and it could quack and it could defecate and it could do all kind of wonderful things that the aristocrats would sit there and clap and laugh their heads off. This year, of course, this is the Cremona Violin Museum, which I visited a year ago, and the quality that goes into these violins, and we're still not able to make any better violins than that. So clearly, these artisans were getting really good at making precision, accurate instruments and machinery. And so that, of course, helps explaining the timing and the location of the Industrial Revolution. And so, here is, I think, something that I'm willing to defend. Why is it that none of Leonardo's inventions ever became a reality, but those of James Watt did? So I've written a poem about this. This is the only poem I will, you will ever hear me reciting myself, but I'm very proud of this poet, so probably is not going to win me any accolades as in literature. But the poem says this: the difference between Leonardo and Watt was that Watt had Wilkinson and Leonardo did not. That's the poem. And here is John Wilkinson. John Wilkinson was an iron master who was in his Sunday clothes, but clearly he was a guy who got dirt under his fingernails, and he is, of course, made this boring machine that allowed Watt to buy from him these cylinders with high degree of accuracy or low tolerance that were necessary if you're going to build a steam engine. And it's people like that, Wilkinson is just one of many, it's people like that that made the Industrial Revolution possible, because they had these aptitudes. And so, there's all kind of evidence that people have been digging out the last few years about this progress in artisanal skill. So there's a paper by Morgan Kelly and Cormac O'Grada that points out that between 1685 and 1810, so the long 18th century, the real price of watches fell. So people are getting better at making watches, the result of learning by doing, micro inventions, if you want, a finer division of labor, a whole bunch of things. But they were getting better at what they were doing. The same is true for making of guns. So Phil Hoffman has had some calculations in which he shows that total factor productivity in making pistols is going up at about 1.1% a year. So we're clearly looking at these artisanal these artisans getting better and better. Now, I don't want to make too much of artisans, because the people who claim that we actually don't need big inventions, we just need artisans, and I don't think that's probably not right. What we need is a sort of a deep complementarity between formal knowledge, like what I showed you earlier about, say, Torricelli and Papa, and the people who are out there, the craftsmen, the engineers, making these things. And it is this cooperation, this sort of togetherness of those types of knowledge that makes for European exceptionalism. And so this is what I call upper tail human capital, or UTHC, which people have been writing about now for quite a while. And basically what it really tells you is that technological progress is driven by an elite of artisans and scientists. And I think Adam Smith actually had that in mind, even though he didn't quite realize he was living at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And he says, to think or to reason comes to be, like every other employment, a particular business, which is carried on by very few people who furnish the public with all the thought and reason possessed by the vast multitudes of that labor. And so the benefits of the speculations of the philosopher he really means the scientist or natural philosophy, may evidently descend to the meanest of people if it led to the improvement in the mechanical arts. So people at this time realized this. And of course, it isn't just mechanical aptitude, it's material. And so here, one example is, of course, the perfection of the so-called crucible process, which is made by Benjamin Huntsman in England in 1740, which produced a vastly superior kind of steel, not very cheap, unfortunately, but very good quality. Even Friedrich Engels, in his Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, actually attributes much of England's industrial might to Huntsman's discovery because it made possible high quality tools and machinery. Now, steel is only one example. There are others, but this is symptomatic of the kind of thing that is at work here. And so mechanical skills then are part of the knowledge that Dr. Johnson was talking about. And I think that is really crucial. I think the success of Europe in generating this knowledge is in large part due to the basic insight that artisans and scientists, or what we would call scientists, should talk to each other. And so science and mathematics really were believed to serve practical purposes. And so Isaac Newton, himself, he said geometry was devised not for the purpose of bare speculation, but for workaday use, okay? And The same, of course, was true for calculus, which he himself helped invent and which was found to be useful in many applications, particularly in hydraulic engineering. And so the phenomenon that I describe here is what I have called the industrial Enlightenment. And many 18th century scientists were deeply interested in practical problems and really didn't mind getting dirt under their fingernails. There's no ivory towers for them in which they were sitting and just speculating about the nature of the universe. So you look at the chemist Joseph Priestley, one of my heroes, who discovered oxygen in 1774, but he also is the guy who invented sparkling water and the pencil eraser. So these are fairly sort of prosaic, mundane inventions, but made by a scientist. And so there's this, as I said, there's this complementarity between what the French called savants, people who knew things, and fabricants, people who made things. And, at times, of course, these two characteristics were embodied in the same person. So here is one of my more heroes. This is a typical industrial Enlightenment man. This is not that as famous as he deserves to be today. This is René Réaumur. These are his dates. That's him. Now, he was trained as a mathematician, and he was a leading lifelong member of the French Académie Royale. But you look at his output, and all the things that he worked on. He worked on iron and steel. He worked on porcelain. He worked on entomology. He showed the feasibility of glass fibers, suggested that paper be made of wood, and on and on and on. So clearly, the scientists of these times, had come to the conclusion that this was something worth doing. In Britain, of course, this connection between scientists and industrialists is deeply socially ingrained. And this is, of course, one of the most famous institutions. This is the Lunar Society of Birmingham. And if I had more time, I would actually point out who all these characters were, but I don't have time for that. But in short, then there is an industrial Enlightenment. And modern economic growth was driven then by this combination of attitude, if you want, culture, and aptitude or skill. And so, I think the genius of the industrial Enlightenment and its role in the rise of Europe is not just that these people believed in progress, but that they actually suggested how it was to be achieved and then wrote down a program to carry it out. And so this is, there's of course two components to that. One is which I've been talking about, which is skills and knowledge. And the other, which I will not have time to talk about, maybe in a minute, just a few words, is the improvement in institutions that constitute this environment. And these were all major changes between 1760 and 1830. All right, so now is the question that you've all been waiting for. Okay, that's the past. What about the future? Can progress continue? And so, it says somewhere in the Talmud, that ever since our second temple was destroyed, the art of prophecy was given to the fool, and every economist I know has been violating that wisdom, and I'll be joining that crowd now. But I'm not going to make any real predictions, but just make 2 points. Is this continuous progress assured? And the attitude that I've been talking about, the skepticism and openness and neophilia, they're still with us. In fact, they're stronger now than they ever were. I mean, skepticism clearly is the bread and butter of our science. Every paper you ever write will go to referees and will find endless things wrong with it. And even after you publish it, people say, yeah, well, we don't believe this. Let's test this. Let's throw more data at it. And that's right. That's how science progresses. And so, in terms of our ability to develop new technology, the answer is almost yes. I mean, nothing is more mistaken than the belief of my much admired colleague, Robert Gordon, and other people like him, who essentially take the attitude of all the low-hanging fruits have been picked and everything that can be invented has been invented. That's all, I think, nonsense. But progress also depends on the right institutional and political environment. And here I am much more worried. There's no guarantee that these will continue to progress, and they may be regressing. So what are we talking about? Well, I can make a little list, and anybody in this audience probably can. And And these institutional features that are important to the continuation of economic progress, and things, like economic liberty, rule of law, civil society, low rent seeking and corruption, tolerance of dissent, a free press, human rights, blah, blah, these are sort of standard things that everybody realize. And there is nothing in economic history that really suggests that these things will continue to progress just the way knowledge progresses. And so the great danger that I see is one of unbalanced growth, and which I mean something different than what we usually mean by it. What I mean by unbalanced growth here is the continued expansion of useful knowledge in biology, in physics, in chemistry, in nanotechnology, in computer, whatever, that's not accompanied by institutional progress. And that gap could create unprecedented hazards to humanity. It's not just nuclear weapons, it's many, many other things. And so there may be a reason why economic historians speak of technological progress, but institutional change. And progress presupposes some kind of trend, some kind of advance toward ever better levels, whereas change basically just could be a stationary process in which there is really no trend. And I think there is some reason to believe that that is the case. And so we have institutional progress versus technological progress. And here I want to end with a quotation that I've made many other times, and this is, I always like to quote it because this is the understatement, not of the century, but of the millennium. And this is the closing paragraph of Sigmund Freud's The Future of an Illusion. And I can read this to you. While mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature, this is written in 1927, by the way, in its control over nature, and may be expected to make still greater ones, it is not possible to establish with certainty that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs. Well, you're not kidding, Sigmund. What can I say? I mean, this is clearly the big concern that we all should have about the future. All right, I think I will end there. Thank you very much. And we have about half an hour to answer questions. Andre, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joel. That's perfect timing. I think we all enjoyed the lecture a lot. First, let me announce the quiz right now, and we would like to invite the audience to check the chats and the links and follow the links and to participate in the quiz. So the winner, let me remind you that the winner of the quiz will get 2 months of free subscription to Bookmate, and the quiz will end in 15 minutes. So please speed up and check your knowledge.
I'm going to put on my headphones so that I can understand the questions better.
Yes, sure, perfect.
All right, there we go.
So once I did this announcement about the quiz, let's move to the questions. We got, I think, more than 100 questions. So we obviously are not in the position to discuss them all. So I will try to do my best to group them. So first of all, I should say that the audience is very well informed, and the questions closely follow the debate on foundations on economic growth and economic development in the academic literature. As you people want to ask your opinion on almost all alternative explanations, institutions, culture, geography, factor cost, so on and so forth. So, but let me, I think we are not able to discuss them all, but I think I would like you to discuss at least one, maybe two, and the first one I will choose myself, and the second, it's up to you. The first one, which I'm choosing, is the most frequent one, and I would summarize it as resources and colonies. How important access to resources in colonies were, how important was it for the development of Europe, for the rise of Europe, or if I put this in the words of Pimanov Alexei from Nizhny Novgorod, who is a high school student actually, he is asking, could such a growth, such European growth, be possible without colonies?
Without coal?
Colonies, not coal, colonies, colonialism, all this stuff.
Ah, colonialism.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Oh yeah, all right, fine, thank you.
People mix these topics because they think that colonies provided access to resources for Europeans.
Well, the real, I'm going to go back to the question I raised at the very beginning, which is, yes, Europeans had colonies, and there are two waves of colonization, if you want, sort of the post-Columbian one, and then there's the 19th century one. But both of these, I think, were driven by the fact that they already had superior knowledge to start with, which is the reason that they colonized parts of Asia and the American continent and later on parts of Africa, and not the other way around. That I think. So I think colonization is a consequence. It's not a cause. Now there is, needless to say, there often is, there's some feedback. So yeah, I mean, it's nicer to have colonies than not to have them, or to be a colony yourself. But I really am very doubtful that even without colonies, that Europe would not have had a very similar kind of history, because none of the things that I talked about, and today we're very much dependent on colonies, and what they got out of colonies, at least until 1780, say the beginning of the revolution in cotton, were primarily things that were nice to have, you know, sugar, spices, chinaware, things like that. But it's hard to argue that sugar, in all due respect, was all that essential to economic development, except perhaps that it got people's teeth to rot faster and maybe gave them diabetes if they had too much of it. But apart from that, I have a hard time understanding why sugar would have been so critical. Much of the slavery in the New World was set up to at first produce sugar. There were some other things as well, but it was mostly sugar. The other thing that came out of the colony was tobacco, and there too, I mean, apart from giving people, you know, lung cancer, you know, tell me exactly what the major economic impact is of tobacco. Now, it is true that once you start talking about cotton, that differs. Cotton grows nowhere in Europe, and it is clearly a very important part of the Industrial Revolution. But here's an interesting historical phenomenon. The importation of cotton from North America began exactly when the North American colonies ceased being a colony and became an independent country. And the lesson from that is that, you know, you don't need to colonize a non-European area in order to get its resources. You can just buy it. And that's, of course, what Britain did, and other countries as well, by buying American cotton. They didn't have to colonize it. You know, it would be nice if it had been. Now, you know, then, of course, later on with India and Africa, clearly these things facilitated to some extent industrial growth. But I have a hard time seeing why this exactly would have driven the things that I talked about knowledge. I mean, you look at these giants of the scientific and industrial revolution, you can make a list of it and ask yourself how many of them would not have done what they did had there been no colonies. And you know that, you know, I mean, if you push me hard enough, I'll find one or two. But by and large, these were engineers, these were chemists, these were colliers, these were all kind of high-skilled or clever people who basically were just looking at the market around them, trying to sell stuff that was either cheaper or better or both. But I don't think that the colonies made all that much of a difference. Now, I do know, I fully understand that Pomerantz, in his Great Divergence book, which I published, so I should know, that Pomerantz talks about this, what's known as ghost acreage. That is to say, acreage that is ghost in the sense it's not in Europe, but it supplies resources to Europe. And clearly that does play a role, but it does play a role in, mostly after the game is already over. So after 1850, with the rise of iron ships and then later subsequently steam shipping, all of a sudden Europe has access to these fantastic resources from elsewhere. But by 1850, its supremacy has already been established. So I am not one of those who buys into the argument that colonies were the cause of the phenomena I talk about. I think of them far more as a consequence, even though there is clearly some kind of positive feedback. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on this agenda about alternative explanation of the rise of Europe. Pick up one about culture in our institutions. People ask about Catholicism. People ask about law, regulation in Europe, how much it contributed to economic development. There are various formulations of more or less the same questions: culture, institutions, geography, obvious alternative explanations to your story.
I could, I have another hour. Look, I did at the end throw in institutions because I do really think they mattered a lot. But there's something I want to say about institutions and about war that I think is not often said enough. So, people have been writing about institutions for quite a while, follow, of course, the pioneering work of my late friend Douglas North, and now the more recent work of Avner Greif and Acemoglu Robinson, and on and on and on. So people have been talking about institutions at great length, and I've written about it. I don't ignore them. But I think there's something that people miss, and that is that a lot of people, particularly Daron and Jim, in their work, tend to associate institutions with politics, with power, with the state. And so there's this whole literature about state capacity and fiscal capacity and how kings and rulers and various other entities that had power started providing public goods. But actually, in my view, the institution that probably played at least as big a role is this sort of transnational institutions that I spend a long chapter about in my book, called the Republic of Letters. So the Republic of Letters is this sort of virtual institution, this network of intellectuals, which we essentially still have, but it has no king, it has no ruler, it's completely, an emergent property, so it's not organized by anybody, it isn't designed by anybody, but by 1600 it's there. And what it does is it sets rules for intellectual innovation. Okay, so the rules are, there's a long list of rules, but the most important ones is that when you discover something, when you make, whatever it may be, if you have a new idea, you place it in the public realm. Okay, so you don't keep it hidden as a secret in your drawer so that only you can teach your students about it and get them pay for it. You publish it. We still do that. I mean, anybody in this game, realize that open science is what's driving us. But that's not legislated by the French king or the English king or the German emperor or the Pope. This is an emergent property. This emerges in the late Middle Ages and early modern time. Okay, so there are other things, like this principle of contestability that I talked about. You put it in the public realm so that other people can check you out and see if you're right or not. And also there's refereeing and then there's this, essentially that kind of notion. So the Republic of Learning, okay, even though it isn't an institution in the standard sense, is actually critical in creating this phenomenon. That's an institution that I think is much more important than what Louis XIV or Emperor Rudolph or any of these other guys did. And so the role of rulers and the role of the state in the rise of European science and technology is actually rather limited. I'm not saying it's zero, but it's rather limited. And in fact, I would make a stronger statement than that. I'll probably get, now I'm going to get probably in trouble, but I'll make it anyway. In Europe, progress in knowledge is largely carried out by the private sector. That is to say, these are individual, if you want, intellectual entrepreneurs, intellectual sellers, you know, highly competitive, who are trying to sell their ideas to their peers, and if they can, to the local duke or king, so that they get a nice patronage job. But the governments themselves, with some exceptions, important to say, some exceptions, but the governments themselves actually played a fairly modest role in advancing knowledge until the 19th century. Then it becomes a more complicated story. And this is very different than it is in China. In China, under the Song dynasty in particular, but the time before it as well, basically we see a lot of inventions. But the striking thing is that most of these inventions are made by bureaucrats. They're made by people in the Mandarin civil service. And both the invention and the dissemination of new knowledge, okay, is carried out by the government. A bit like, I would say, the Soviet system, you know, at least in principle. And, you know, that actually is not a bad system. It worked for a while. And in fact, certainly by 1200, you know, China was way ahead of Europe. But the problem is that if you leave the advancement of knowledge to the public sector, you leave it to the emperor, as it was, and his bureaucracy in China, at some point, the emperor can decide, we're no longer interested. You know, we want peace, we want stability, we want quiet, we don't want all this new stuff. That's, of course, what happens increasingly in China under Ming and Qing dynasties. And that's, of course, one reason why China can't keep up with Europe. Whereas in Europe, you know, you have governments who don't like new stuff. But if they don't, you know, their innovators will just go somewhere else. And they did. You know, and so there are places in Europe where conservatism, or if you want, reactionary government, is critical. And I think about Spain to some extent, you know, other places, perhaps south of Italy. But what happens is these people just go somewhere else, and progress just continues. And in that sense, I think the role of the state in bringing about the kind of things that I talked about is probably fairly modest. And I think that does make a big difference. You don't want government to meddle too much with it. Doug North always used to say that, you know, the marriage between technology and the state is like a bad marriage. They can't live with each other and they can't live without each other. So I don't know, I mean, he'd say things like that. But I think there's something to be said for that. So I'm not that, you know, I think institutions matter a lot, but it's made me far more than just the state and state capacity and taxes and, you know, public goods provided by the state, and certainly about war. I mean, I want to talk about war because it will take too long, but you know, there is a new literature now that actually thinks that war was really, you know, a major stimulant to economic development. And I must say, I belong to the camp that says, you know, hold on, okay? You know, there's good things about war, perhaps, but there's lots of bad things. And there's somebody who weighs the bad things against the good things. You know, I'm not willing to put a lot of money on that.
Okay, thanks. But in the late answer, you mentioned the Soviet example and the Russian example. Given the audience, you can imagine that there are numerous number of questions about the Russian case, and people want you comment on the Russian experience. For example, Arhina Anna from Utrecht University, who is a student there, she wants you to comment on the experience of the imperial Russia and why, whether it is belong to Europe, whether it doesn't belong to Europe, how well your story fit to this experience. And the second type of questions which we have about Russia, and this obviously is about the Soviet Union. You already started to answer. But here in the questions, people disagree how we want to evaluate the experience. So I don't want to pick up any question. I just would like to ask you to comment a bit more about the Soviet experience and how well Soviet innovations fit to your general story.
Well, there is, I must say, I'm probably one of the few people connected to this conversation who actually remembers the launching of Sputnik. And it was a huge deal. And it wasn't just that for the first time we had sent a satellite into space, right? It is that a planned economy in which science and technology were controlled by the government was going to be superior than a free enterprise economy. I mean, I was 11 years old, so I wasn't quite thinking in those exact terms. But that was the upshot of the newspapers and the radio at that time, saying, "Wow, that system really works better than ours." And within the United States, as we know now, there were a whole bunch of economists led by people like John Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, who basically said, this is the way that the economy should be organized, because clearly, technologically, it is a superior system. And, theoretically, I think this is justifiable, because we all know that there's major market failures with the development of science and technology in terms of appropriability and fixed cost, and this is sort of basic economics of science and technology, and that the free market really isn't, it has great difficulties of organizing it, and we really need plans and a government to interfere and do this for us. And a priori, this was not something that can be decided by theory. It's only experience that teaches us that. And I think this is not a glass that's completely empty or completely full. There is no question that, technologically speaking, Soviet systems, I don't want to just talk about the Soviet Union, and there's a whole bunch of sort of planned economies around it, both in Asia and in Eastern Europe, of course, and that these societies were complete failures as far as technology is concerned. And yet it became quite clear in the 1970s and 1980s that planned economies were not as innovative as free market economies. And I think that by now you will find very few economists, this side of Mariana Mazzucato maybe, who would argue that without major government intervention, we cannot keep innovating. And I actually, even though I think I like her work, and I think she makes some very good points, but I think it's basically the case that what innovation depends on is what Europe has always done, which is competition, free entry, tolerance of non-conformism. Okay, that is one of the critical things. Okay, what you see in Europe, and this is what I talked about it, is you need societies in which people are willing to be non-conformist, or if you in intellectual terms, intellectual deviants, so people who go against the grain. Now, the fact of life is that if you look at people who are non-conformist, who are maybe eccentric, maybe unusual, 99 out of 100 of them are actually going to be crackpots who just come up with bogus theories, which will end up in the garbage can of history. But one will come up with something brilliant, and you don't know which one. So you have to be tolerant to all of them. And I think in free economies, okay, one of the freedoms that you have is the freedom to be a crackpot, to be considered to be a nut, or or at least come up with some kind of insane idea. And every once in a while, somebody with an insane idea comes up with a brilliant solution that will change the world. That, I think, is critical. Now, I want to say something else, since you asked me about Russia. Actually, I use the example of Russia as one of the sort of stark examples of how well the European system works. Because you look at the history of Russia before 1917, you realize one thing, and that is that almost all their institutional and technological improvements are part of the competitive state system that emerges in Europe, okay? All the way going back to Piotr the Great, okay, who went to the West, went to the Netherlands, went to England, basically to learn. Why? Because he had to fight the Swedes. And this happens, over and over again in Russian history. You have, conservative governments who don't want anything to do with innovation, but then they realize they fall behind and they lose the Crimean War or something. And so they go, we have to change our system. And so the competition of Russia with its European neighbors is a very good example of the way Europe worked and China did not, because China doesn't have any neighbors that threaten it the way the Germans or the Austrians or the Turks or the Swedes threatened Russia. And so they really didn't have to worry all that much about constantly keeping up, particularly not, I think, after the rise to power of the Qing dynasty. And so in that sense, I think the experience of Russia is a very good example of how the European system worked. And what, of course, was true for Russia was true for everybody else, because everybody had neighbors and everybody was worried about their neighbors. And therefore, that clearly made it possible for this competitive system to produce good outcomes in the very long run, as well, of course, a few very bad outcomes like war.
Okay, thanks. One technical thing: can you stop sharing the screen? The audience. Audience wants to see you.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually a good question.
There should be a button. Share screen on the bottom.
No, now all you see is the screen, right?
Yeah.
See, maybe more. Let me see if I can do this. Hide. I can stop the video, but you don't see me either.
Oh, please. Okay, then if it is difficult, let's move on.
How's that?
Yeah, now it works. Perfect. Okay, great.
I hit the escape button. That's what.
Perfect. So let's back to the global agenda from Russia. So in your view, the Great Enrichment is a part of Great Divergence, probably, debate. And I would like to pronounce the question by Savin Leonid from VGU University, from Voronezh University, and he is asking what are the subjects or areas that remain unexplored in the context of the Great Divergence problem, and what is the frontier? What should be done next, in your view, in this broad agenda, broad topic?
Well, and so I think, and this is part of my current joint work, which he still has unpublished, with my colleagues Guido Tabellini at Bocconi and Avner Greif at Stanford. And we're working on an essay, really, or a short book, in which we are trying to look at differences in what we call social organization. So the thing I have barely mentioned or not talked about at all is that one of the ways in which Europe is different from China, and it may be underlying the Great Divergence, is that in Europe, in the Middle Ages, the nuclear family becomes the fundamental unit of organization in society. So there's a bunch of papers that have come out by different people. I would mention Jonathan Schultz at George Mason. I would mention the new book that's forthcoming in a few months by my friend Joe Henrik at Harvard in the evolutionary biology department. There's a paper by Stephen Henke, a young economist at Harvard, and they all look at the importance of family structure, whether families live in smaller units or they live in extended units or parts of clans. And it turns out that that is strongly correlated with what Tabellini famously called a general morality as opposed to limited morality. So general morality is a world in which basically you don't treat your family members different from anybody else. You're respectful and you obey the rules within a larger society because you feel that that's the way that's right to behave. In a limited morality, you are very loyal to the members of your immediate family, your immediate surrounding, but you're very hostile to everybody else. And those are alternative ways of organizing society. And what we're trying to see as the importance of the clan system in Europe and else in China and elsewhere, as opposed to the nuclear family in Europe, that actually made a big difference. It may or it may not have been. It's a bit different than the state system and the competition between nations that I talked about, and it's certainly different from colonialism. It goes back to the sort of fundamental building blocks of society and what they mean for culture and things like that. So this is still work in progress, and I don't want to, and that's one frontier I think in which we are moving. The other thing that's I think something which we're going to come back to is I think the importance of religion. And what I mean is not the sort of standard Weberian argument of Catholics against Protestants, but much more what religion dictates in terms of how much are you willing to innovate? How much are you willing to challenge nature? So how much are you willing to inflict damage on your environment because you think God created this environment for you so you can do with it whatever you want, as opposed to religions that see you much more as a custodian, somebody who's in charge of keeping the environment more or less as it is. Okay, and I'm not taking positions on whether that's good or bad. I just think these differences are really important. And I would argue, I have actually argued, that one of the ways in which religion mattered in the European past is that European beliefs, particularly sort of Judeo-Christian beliefs, are much more anthropocentric. that place humans in the center of the creation. God created this universe for us, and if we exploit it, we're actually showing how great he is. That's actually one of the messages of Francis Bacon in the beginning of the 17th century. That really resonated at the time. Now, I'm not sure it resonates all that much today. I doubt it very much. But certainly in the past, this may have made a very big difference, as opposed to religions in which there was much more of a sense that, we are part of nature and we shouldn't challenge it too much, because otherwise the heavens will get angry at us or something like that. I mean, that's a view, I think, that merits, it's not new. People have argued this for a while, but it's something that merits further visitation. So those are the two frontiers that I'm thinking of right now. There may well be others I'm not thinking of, because this is still very much a topic that's on everybody's mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Joel.
Are we done?
Yes, times goes fast.
I'm just getting started.
I know, and actually I managed to ask you only, I don't know, 5 questions out of more than 100. So I will send you all these questions. Maybe you find it useful, and maybe you would like to answer particular people. Actually, we can use our website if you want for your written answers, if you have enough time and energy to do this. And
so energy probably more than time, but we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, but sure, absolutely, of course. But anyway, I will be happy to share with you all these questions. So the only thing which is left for today is to announce the winner for the best question. And of course, my choice is very subjective, and but in the end, I decided to give the prize to the person who asked one of the questions about Russia, and probably this was the question which you answered for the longest for the longest period of time during the Q&A session. So the prize goes to Konstantinov Alexander, a high school student from school 1541, I guess, in Moscow, but maybe in our place in Russia, for his question about how for his question about the role of Russia in your theory, in your story. And at this moment, let me thanks again you, and
thank you.
Remind the audience that the next lecture is in a week, and the Nobel Prize winner Estelle Duflo will continue our series. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
All right. Stay safe, everybody.
Yes.
Most important in this day and age is staying safe. And wear your mask.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.